The brothers who made their father pay, a revenge written in blood. There are some crimes that defy human comprehension, that force us to question everything we think we know about family, love, and justice. In the quiet suburbs of Goiânia, Brazil, a story unfolded that would shake the very foundations of what we consider acceptable, even in the name of revenge. It's the story of two brothers who decided that the justice system had failed them and that they would become judge, jury, and executioner of their own father. The house at 247 Rua das Acacias looked like any other middle-class home in the neighborhood. White walls, a small garden, children's bicycles scattered on the front lawn. From the outside, it was the picture of domestic tranquility. But behind those walls lived a family harboring secrets so dark that when they finally came to light, they would transform two innocent children into instruments of the most calculated vengeance imaginable. This isn't just a story about murder. It's a story about what happens when love turns to hate, when protection becomes persecution, when the very person meant to keep you safe becomes your greatest threat. It's about two boys who watched their mother die slowly, knowing exactly who was responsible and who spent years planning the perfect revenge. The crime that shocked Goiânia in 2019 didn't happen overnight. It was the culmination of 15 years of abuse, manipulation, and a mother's desperate attempts to protect her children from the monster she had married. When Maria Santos finally succumbed to what doctors called complications from chronic illness, her sons knew the truth. Their father hadn't just killed their mother, he had tortured her to death, slowly and methodically, over the course of years. And they were going to make him pay for every single day of her suffering. The morning of March 15, 2019, started like any other in the Santos household. Roberto Santos, 52, a respected accountant in the community, was having his morning coffee when his two sons, Carlos, 19, and Miguel, 17, approached him with unusual calm. What he didn't know was that this would be the last normal moment of his life. What he could not have imagined was that his own children had been planning his demise for over a year, studying his routines, his weaknesses, his fears. The brothers had learned patience from watching their mother endure years of systematic abuse. They had learned precision from observing how their father had slowly poisoned her, both physically and emotionally. And they had learned that sometimes the only justice available is the justice you create yourself. But what they were about to do would cross every line of human decency, transforming victims into perpetrators in a cycle of violence that would haunt everyone involved. If you're wondering how two seemingly normal teenagers could plan and execute such a methodical revenge, you're about to discover that some wounds run so deep that they poison everything they touch. The origins. The Santos family's descent into darkness began when Maria Helena Santos met Roberto in 1998 at a church social event in Goiânia. He was charming, successful, and seemed to embody everything a young woman could want in a husband. What Maria didn't know was that Roberto was a master manipulator who had spent years perfecting his public persona. The first signs of his true nature appeared during their honeymoon. Small things at first, criticism disguised as concern, isolation presented as protection, control masked as love. By the time Carlos was born in 2000, Maria was already trapped in a web of psychological manipulation so complex that she couldn't see the bars of her own cage. The physical abuse started when Carlos was 2 years old. It began with accidents, a push that was supposedly playful, a grip that left bruises but could be explained away. Roberto was careful, methodical. He never left marks where others could see them, never struck in anger, always with calculated precision. When Miguel was born in 2002, the abuse escalated. Roberto seemed to view his wife's attention to the children as a betrayal, a theft of what belonged to him. He began to punish her for being a good mother, creating impossible standards that she could never meet. But it was the psychological torture that truly broke Maria. Roberto would wake her in the middle of the night to berate her for imagined failures. He would hide her medications and then mock her when she became sick. He would promise family outings and then cancel them at the last minute, blaming her for some fabricated transgression. The children watched it all. Carlos, being older, understood more of what was happening. He saw how his mother flinched when his father entered a room, how she would check and double-check everything to avoid his anger, how she gradually became a shadow of the woman she had once been. Miguel, younger and more sensitive, absorbed the trauma differently. He became hypervigilant, constantly watching for signs of his father's mood, trying to protect his mother in the only ways a small child could, by being perfect, by never causing trouble, by becoming invisible when necessary. Both boys learned to read their father's moods with the precision of meteorologists tracking a dangerous storm. They knew which footsteps meant safety and which meant someone was about to suffer. They developed elaborate systems of silent communication, warning each other when to hide, when to stay quiet, when to create distractions. The slow poisoning began when Carlos was 12 and Miguel was 10. Roberto had discovered that certain household chemicals, when administered in small doses over time, could cause symptoms that mimicked chronic illness. He began adding them to Maria's food, her drinks, even her toothpaste. Maria's health began to deteriorate in ways that baffled doctors. She suffered from constant nausea, severe headaches, joint pain that made it difficult to walk. Multiple hospital visits yielded no clear diagnosis. Roberto played the role of the concerned husband perfectly, always by her side during medical appointments, always asking the right questions, always appearing devastated by his wife's mysterious illness. The boys watched their mother waste away, and slowly they began to understand what their father was doing. But understanding and being able to prove it were two very different things. The first signs. The moment Carlos truly understood what his father was doing came on a rainy Tuesday evening when he was 14. He had forgotten his homework and returned home unexpectedly to find Roberto in the kitchen, carefully measuring a clear liquid into his mother's evening tea. The concentration on his father's face, the methodical precision of his movements, the way he disposed of the evidence, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Carlos stood frozen in the doorway, watching his father commit what he now realized was attempted murder in slow motion. When Roberto noticed him, there was a moment of absolute silence where father and son stared at each other, both understanding that everything had changed. "Your mother has been feeling unwell," Roberto said calmly, continuing to stir the tea as if nothing had happened. "I'm adding some vitamins to help her feel better." But Carlos had seen the bottle Roberto had used, had recognized the cleaning solution from under the kitchen sink. He said nothing, nodded, and went to his room. But that night he lay awake planning how to save his mother's life. The first thing he did was start documenting everything. He began keeping a journal, recording every instance of abuse he witnessed, every time his mother became sick, after eating or drinking something his father had prepared, every hospital visit and unexplained symptom. He took photos of bruises when he could, recorded conversations when possible, and began building a case that he hoped would one day bring his father to justice. Miguel, now 12, became his reluctant partner in this dangerous game of evidence gathering. The younger boy was terrified of their father, but his love for his mother overcame his fear. Together, they developed a system of surveillance that would have impressed professional investigators. Most importantly, they began trying to protect their mother by intercepting the poisoned food and drinks when possible. They would accidentally spill her coffee, claim they were thirsty and drink her juice before she could, or create distractions that prevented her from consuming what their father had prepared. Their efforts helped, but they couldn't catch everything. Maria's health continued to decline, and the boys watched helplessly as the woman they loved slowly faded away. They tried to tell her what they suspected, but Maria refused to believe that her husband could be capable of such evil. The years of psychological manipulation had done their work too well. She had been conditioned to doubt her own perceptions, to blame herself for everything that went wrong, to see Roberto as her protector rather than her destroyer. Carlos, now 15, began researching legal options. He learned about domestic violence laws, about how to report suspected poisoning, about what evidence would be needed to build a case. But every avenue he explored led to the same conclusion. Without their mother's cooperation, and without concrete proof that would stand up in court, the authorities would be powerless to act. Roberto's reputation in the community was too strong, his public persona too convincing. The boys' word against his would never be enough, especially since they were minors with no independent credibility. It was around this time that Carlos began to consider other options. If the legal system couldn't protect his mother, perhaps he and Miguel would have to find another way. The idea of killing their father first occurred to Carlos during one of their mother's worst episodes. She had been vomiting for 3 days straight, was so weak she could barely stand, and Roberto was playing the concerned husband while secretly increasing the doses of whatever he was giving her. Carlos watched his father's performance and felt something cold and hard crystallize in his chest. This man had stolen their mother's life, their childhood, their sense of safety in the world. He had turned their home into a prison and their family into his personal torture chamber. The thought should have horrified Carlos. Instead, it filled him with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. The escalation. The planning began in earnest when Carlos turned 16. He had spent 2 years documenting his father's crimes, 2 years watching his mother deteriorate, 2 years feeling helpless in the face of systematic abuse. Now, he decided, it was time to take action. But this wouldn't be a crime of passion or a moment of rage. Carlos had learned patience from years of helpless observation, and he intended to use that patience to plan the perfect revenge. If he and Miguel were going to risk everything to stop their father, they needed to ensure they wouldn't be caught. The first step was studying their father's routines with even greater intensity. Roberto was a creature of habit, which made him predictable. He left for work at exactly 7:30 a.m. every weekday, returned at 6:15 p.m., and spent his evenings in his home office working on client files. He went to bed at 10:30 p.m. and woke at 6 a.m. Weekends followed a similarly rigid schedule. Carlos began to map out windows of opportunity, times when Roberto would be vulnerable and when he and Miguel would have alibis. He studied the layout of their house with new eyes, identifying entry and exit points, potential weapons, places where evidence might be hidden or destroyed. Most importantly, he began researching methods. Carlos spent hours in internet cafes, using public computers to research poisons, torture techniques, and ways to make death look accidental. He was careful to vary his locations and to never use the same computer twice. Miguel, now 14, was initially reluctant to participate in his brother's increasingly dark plans. The younger boy was naturally gentle, more inclined toward finding peaceful solutions. But as their mother's condition worsened, as the poisoning became more obvious and more cruel, Miguel's resistance began to crumble. The turning point came on their mother's birthday. Roberto had promised to take the family out for dinner, something that hadn't happened in years. Maria was so excited that she managed to get dressed up despite her weakness, put on makeup to hide her pallor, and even smiled for the first time in months. At the last minute, Roberto announced that he had to work late and the dinner was cancelled. But the boys knew he was lying. They had seen him on the phone earlier, heard him arranging to meet friends at a bar. He was cancelling their mother's birthday dinner, not because he had to, but because he could. Because destroying her hope gave him pleasure. That night, As their mother cried herself to sleep, Miguel came to Carlos's room. "I want to help," he said simply. "Tell me what we need to do." The brothers spent the next 6 months refining their plan. They decided that their father's death needed to accomplish several goals. It had to look like an accident to avoid suspicion. It had to happen in a way that would allow their mother to inherit his assets and insurance money. And most importantly, it had to involve enough suffering to balance the scales of justice. The solution came to Carlos in a moment of inspiration. Their father had a routine of working late in his home office on Friday nights, usually until well past midnight. The office was in the basement, soundproofed, because Roberto claimed he needed quiet to concentrate. The isolation that Roberto had created for his own convenience would become the perfect setting for his downfall. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. On a Friday night when their mother was visiting her sister, the boys would confront their father in his office. They would force him to confess to his crimes, make him understand the full extent of the suffering he had caused, and then they would make him pay for every moment of their mother's pain. They spent weeks gathering supplies and preparing their basement prison. They acquired restraints, tools, and recording equipment. They researched interrogation techniques and methods of inflicting pain without causing immediate death. They wanted their father to experience every emotion their mother had felt: fear, helplessness, despair, and finally, the terrible understanding that no one was coming to save him. The date was set for March 15th, 2019. Their mother would be away visiting her sister, as she did once a month. Roberto would be in his office, as he was every Friday night, and the boys would finally have their chance to balance the scales. The crime. March 15th, 2019, began like any other Friday in the Santos household. Roberto left for work at his usual time, kissed his wife goodbye with the same false affection he had displayed for 20 years, and reminded the boys to behave themselves while their mother was visiting her sister. He had no idea that his sons had been counting down to this day for months. Maria left for her sister's house at 2 p.m., as planned. The boys watched from the window as Roberto's car disappeared down the street, knowing it would be the last time they saw their father as free men. The weight of what they were about to do should have been crushing, but instead they felt a strange sense of relief. After years of helpless observation, they were finally going to act. The afternoon was spent in final preparations. They moved their supplies to the basement office, tested their restraints and recording equipment, and went over their plan one final time. Carlos had written out a list of questions they wanted their father to answer, a comprehensive accounting of every crime he had committed against their family. At 6:15 p.m., Roberto returned home as scheduled. He seemed pleased to find the house quiet and orderly, his sons apparently occupied with homework and television. He had no way of knowing that every move he made was being observed, that his children were tracking his location in the house with the precision of hunters stalking prey. Roberto followed his usual Friday routine: a quick dinner, some television, and then down to his basement office to work on client files. The boys waited until 9 p.m., when they knew he would be fully absorbed in his work and unlikely to be disturbed. Carlos went down first, carrying a tray with coffee and cookies, a gesture of filial devotion that their father would find touching. Miguel followed a few minutes later, ostensibly to ask a question about homework. By the time Roberto realized that both his sons were in the office and that the door had been locked behind them, it was too late. "What's going on?" Roberto asked, looking up from his computer with mild annoyance. "I told you I didn't want to be disturbed." "We need to talk, Dad," Carlos said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "We need to talk about Mom." Roberto's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of wariness crossing his features. "What about your mother? She's visiting your aunt, as you well know." "We know what you've been doing to her," Miguel said, his voice barely above a whisper. We know about the poison." The change in Roberto's demeanor was immediate and terrifying. The mask of paternal concern dropped away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. For a moment, the boys saw their father as he truly was, not the respected community member or loving husband, but a predator who had been caught. "I don't know what you think you know," Roberto said carefully, "but you're mistaken. Your mother is ill. I've been trying to help her." "We have pictures," Carlos said, pulling out a folder of evidence they had compiled. "We have recordings. We know about the chemicals in the garage, the things you put in her food, the way you time her symptoms with your treatments." Roberto stared at the folder for a long moment, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and calculations. When he looked up at his sons again, his expression had hardened into something that made both boys step back involuntarily. "You stupid children," he said, his voice carrying a venom they had never heard before. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Your mother is weak, pathetic, worthless. Everything I've done has been to put her out of her misery. And if you think you can threaten me with your little games, you're more foolish than I thought." It was the confession they had hoped for, but hearing it spoken aloud was more devastating than either boy had anticipated. This was their father, the man who was supposed to protect and love them, casually admitting to slowly murdering their mother and expressing nothing but contempt for his victims. "You're going to pay for what you've done," Carlos said, his voice shaking with rage. "You're going to suffer like she suffered." Roberto laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humanity. "And what exactly do you think you can do to me? You're children. I'm your father. When this is over, you'll go to your rooms, and we'll never speak of this again." That's when Miguel produced the taser they had purchased online, and Roberto Santos learned that his children were no longer the helpless victims he had always believed them to be. The impact. The first shock from the taser dropped Roberto to the floor, his body convulsing as electricity coursed through his nervous system. The boys had researched the device carefully, knowing they needed something that would incapacitate without causing permanent damage. At least, not initially. They wanted their father conscious and aware for what was to come. As Roberto lay gasping on the basement floor, Carlos and Miguel worked quickly to secure him to the chair they had prepared. They had practiced this moment dozens of times, using a mannequin to perfect their technique. The restraints were tight enough to prevent escape, but positioned to avoid cutting off circulation. They needed their father alive and alert for the conversation they were about to have. When Roberto regained full consciousness, he found himself bound hand and foot, facing a video camera that Carlos had set up to record everything that was about to happen. The boys had decided that their father's confession and punishment needed to be documented, both for their own psychological closure and as evidence of justice served. "This is insane," Roberto said, testing his bonds and finding them secure. "Untie me right now, and we can forget this ever happened." "No," Carlos replied, his voice carrying a new authority that surprised even him. "We're going to talk about what you did to our mother. We're going to talk about every day of suffering you caused her, every night she cried herself to sleep, every time you made her believe she was worthless." What followed was a methodical interrogation that lasted for hours. The boys had studied their father's methods, had learned from his example how to break down a person's resistance through a combination of physical discomfort and psychological pressure. Roberto's resistance crumbled gradually. The man who had terrorized his family for 20 years discovered that he was fundamentally a coward when faced with his own mortality. He began to confess, first in fragments and denials, then in increasingly detailed admissions of guilt. He admitted to poisoning Maria systematically for over 7 years. He described how he had researched various chemicals and their effects, how he had calibrated doses to maximize suffering while avoiding detection. He confessed to the psychological abuse, to the deliberate isolation, to the systematic destruction of his wife's self-esteem and independence. Most damning of all, he admitted that he had enjoyed it. The power, the control, the ability to determine another person's reality. It had given him a sense of superiority that he found intoxicating. Maria's suffering hadn't been a byproduct of his actions, it had been the point. As the night wore on, as their father's confessions became more detailed and more horrifying, the boys felt their remaining humanity slipping away. They had begun this as an act of justice, but it was becoming something darker. Over the course of 72 hours, Roberto Santos was systematically tortured by his own children. They used techniques they had researched online, methods designed to cause maximum psychological and physical suffering without causing immediate death. They wanted him to experience every emotion their mother had felt: fear, helplessness, despair, and finally, the terrible understanding that no one was coming to save him. By the end, Roberto was no longer the man who had terrorized his family. He was a broken, sobbing shell who had confessed to crimes that would have sent him to prison for life. But for Carlos and Miguel, confession wasn't enough. They had promised their father would suffer as their mother had suffered, and they intended to keep that promise. Roberto Santos died on Monday morning, March 18th, from a combination of dehydration, shock, and cardiac arrest brought on by prolonged stress and pain. His sons had documented everything, creating a video record of both his confessions and their revenge, the investigation. Roberto Santos was found dead in his basement office when he failed to show up for work, and concerned colleagues asked police to perform a welfare check. The scene that greeted investigators was unlike anything they had encountered in their careers. Roberto was still secured to the chair where his sons had left him, but he was no longer the respected accountant the community had known. The body showed signs of systematic torture that had been inflicted over a period of approximately 72 hours. The medical examiner would later determine that death had resulted from a combination of dehydration, shock, and cardiac arrest brought on by prolonged stress and pain. But it was the video evidence that truly shocked investigators. Carlos and Miguel had left behind a complete recording of their father's interrogation and punishment, a methodical documentation of both his confessions and their revenge. The footage revealed not only the extent of Roberto's crimes against his family, but also the cold, calculated nature of his son's response. Detective Maria Oliveira, the lead investigator on the case, would later describe the videos as the most disturbing evidence she had ever encountered. It wasn't just the violence, she explained. It was the systematic nature of it. The way these boys had planned every detail. They had become the very thing they were fighting against. The investigation revealed the full scope of the Santos family's tragedy. Medical records confirmed that Maria Santos had indeed been systematically poisoned, with toxicology reports showing traces of various household chemicals in her system dating back years. The evidence that Carlos and Miguel had compiled was comprehensive and damning, providing a clear picture of sustained domestic abuse that had somehow escaped detection by authorities. Neighbors and community members struggled to reconcile the Roberto Santos they thought they knew with the monster revealed in the investigation. He had been a pillar of the community, a man who organized charity drives and never missed church. The revelation that he had been slowly murdering his wife while maintaining this facade shattered many people's faith in their ability to judge character. The boys' methodical planning became clear as investigators pieced together their activities in the months leading up to the crime. They had researched torture techniques, purchased equipment online using prepaid cards, and even practiced their interrogation methods. The level of premeditation was staggering, especially considering their ages. Carlos and Miguel were arrested at their aunt's house, where they had gone to be with their mother after completing their father's execution. They showed no remorse, no regret, no emotion at all. When asked why they had documented their crimes so thoroughly, Carlos simply replied, "We wanted everyone to know the truth about what he did." The trial. The trial of Carlos and Miguel Santos began 18 months after their father's death in September 2020. The case presented prosecutors with an unprecedented dilemma. The boys had clearly committed murder, and the torture they had inflicted was inexcusable by any legal standard. But they had also been victims of sustained abuse, and their father's crimes were equally horrific. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Fernando Ribeiro, acknowledged that Roberto Santos had committed terrible crimes against his family, but insisted that this did not give his sons the right to become judge, jury, and executioner. "We cannot allow vigilante justice," Ribeiro argued in his opening statement. "If we excuse these crimes because we sympathize with the perpetrators' suffering, we open the door to chaos. The law exists to prevent exactly this kind of cycle of violence." The defense, led by renowned criminal attorney Dr. Patricia Mendez, argued that the boys had been driven to their actions by years of psychological trauma and the complete failure of every system that should have protected them. "These boys didn't wake up one day and decide to become killers," Dr. Mendez argued. "They were systematically brutalized and conditioned by a man who should have been their protector. They watched their mother die slowly, knowing exactly who was responsible, and they saw that no one was going to help them." The most compelling testimony came from Maria Santos herself. Still weak from years of poisoning, she took the stand to describe the systematic abuse her family had endured. Her testimony was devastating, painting a picture of a man who had used his intelligence and social standing to create a perfect prison for his family. "He made me believe I was worthless," Maria testified, her voice barely audible. "He convinced me that no one would believe me if I tried to leave, that I deserved everything that happened to me. My boys tried to protect me, but they were just children. What else could they do?" The boys themselves took the stand in their own defense. Carlos, now 19, spoke with a maturity that was chilling in someone so young. He showed no emotion as he described planning his father's death, no regret as he detailed the torture they had inflicted. "We tried everything else," Carlos testified. "We documented his crimes. We tried to protect our mother. We looked for legal solutions. Nothing worked. He was going to kill her, and no one was going to stop him except us." Miguel's testimony was more emotional, revealing the psychological toll the crime had taken on the younger brother. He broke down several times while describing their father's abuse, but remained firm in his conviction that they had done the right thing. "I dream about it every night," Miguel admitted. "Not about what we did to him, but about what he did to our mother. I see her crying, see her getting sicker, see her believing his lies about how worthless she was. We couldn't let him win." After 6 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for 4 days before reaching a verdict that would satisfy no one and leave fundamental questions unanswered. Inside the criminal's mind. The psychological evaluation of Carlos and Miguel Santos revealed minds shaped by trauma in ways that challenged conventional understanding of criminal behavior. Dr. Amanda Silva, the court-appointed psychiatrist, spent months interviewing the brothers before reaching conclusions that would influence their sentencing. "These boys don't fit any standard profile of juvenile killers," Dr. Silva explained in her testimony. "They weren't acting out of rage or impulse. They had developed a sophisticated moral framework that justified extreme violence as a form of justice. In their minds, they weren't committing murder. They were executing a sentence." Carlos, the older brother and primary architect of the crime, displayed what Dr. Silva described as compartmentalized empathy. He was capable of deep emotional connection with victims of abuse, particularly his mother, but had completely dehumanized his father. He sees himself as an instrument of justice, Dr. Silva noted. He genuinely believes that what he did was not only justified, but necessary. There's no guilt, no remorse, because in his moral framework, he was protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty. Miguel's psychological profile was more complex. The younger brother showed clear signs of trauma and guilt, but also demonstrated a disturbing ability to rationalize extreme violence. He had followed his brother's lead, not out of bloodthirst, but out of love for their mother, and a desperate need to feel powerful in a situation where he had been helpless for years. The psychological evaluations revealed that both boys had been profoundly shaped by their father's methods. Roberto had been a master manipulator who had taught his sons, through negative example, how to read people's weaknesses and exploit them. The boys had turned these skills against their teacher with devastating effectiveness. They learned from the best, Dr. Silva noted grimly. Roberto Santos created his own destroyers by teaching them exactly how to break a human being. The irony is that his own techniques were ultimately used against him. The evaluations also revealed the extent to which the boys had been forced to mature beyond their years. Carlos, in particular, had been functioning as the family's protector since he was a young child, making life and death decisions about his mother's safety on a daily basis. These boys never had a childhood, Dr. Silva explained. They were soldiers in a war they didn't choose, fighting an enemy who should have been their protector. By the time they committed this crime, they had already been living with the psychological burden of adults for years. Reflective conclusion. The Santos case concluded with a verdict that satisfied no one and resolved nothing. Carlos was sentenced to 25 years in prison for first-degree murder, while Miguel received 15 years for second-degree murder, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. The sentences reflected the court's struggle to balance the boys' crimes against the extraordinary circumstances that had shaped them. Judge Helena Carvalho, in delivering the sentences, acknowledged the impossible nature of the case. This court has been asked to weigh justice against mercy, punishment against understanding, the rule of law against the failure of every system that should have protected this family, she said. There are no good answers here, only the hope that some measure of justice has been served. Maria Santos recovered physically from years of poisoning, but the psychological scars proved more lasting. She visits her sons in prison regularly, carrying the impossible burden of loving the children who killed to protect her. In interviews, she has expressed both gratitude for their intervention and horror at what they became in the process. "They saved my life," she said in a rare public statement, "but they destroyed their own lives to do it. I don't know if that's justice or tragedy. Maybe it's both." The case sparked nationwide debates about domestic violence, the failure of protective services, and the question of whether extreme circumstances can ever justify extreme responses. Some saw the boys as heroes who had done what the system failed to do. Others viewed them as cautionary tales about the cycle of violence and the danger of taking justice into one's own hands. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Santos case is how easily it could have been prevented. Roberto's abuse was systematic and prolonged, leaving traces that trained professionals should have detected. The boys' deteriorating behavior at school, their mother's mysterious illness, the family's increasing isolation, all were warning signs that went unheeded. Carlos and Miguel Santos began as innocent children who wanted nothing more than to protect their mother. They ended as killers who had crossed every line of human decency in pursuit of what they saw as justice. Their transformation from victims to perpetrators illustrates the complex relationship between trauma and violence, between love and revenge. Their story serves as a reminder that monsters are not born but made, shaped by circumstances and choices that can transform anyone into something unrecognizable. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that under extreme circumstances, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil, even when their intentions begin with love. The boys who drew pictures for their mother became the young men who tortured their father to death. The children who tried to protect became the killers who destroyed. And in that transformation lies a truth about human nature that we would prefer not to acknowledge. That the line between victim and perpetrator, between justice and revenge, between love and hate, is far thinner than we want to believe. Today, Carlos serves his sentence with the same methodical precision he brought to planning his father's death. Miguel struggles with guilt and trauma, slowly working towards some form of redemption. Their mother lives with the knowledge that her children became killers to save her life. The brothers, who made their father pay, wrote their revenge in blood, but the price they paid was their own humanity. In seeking justice for their mother, they lost themselves. And perhaps that is the most tragic aspect of their story, that in a world where systems fail and evil prospers, sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to become one yourself. If this story intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to learn about other real crimes that shock the world and the minds behind them.